Hello, my name is Osha, and I like talking about history. And I've been discussing um, Iran and taking us back to the history of you know um, Iranians and Persians. They're known as Persians, they're known as Iranians. I have a video that I'm going to do discussing how Persia came to be Iran, and in terms of their name, the identity. But today, what I want to discuss is how Iran gave us the game of polo. Polo, when I was growing up in Nigeria, was a very popular sport. It's still a very popular sport amongst many of my friends, who belong to the polo club in Nigeria. Polo is very popular in Nigeria, but polo is from Iran. In fact, um, UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, recognizes polo as an Iranian sport. So it's one of the world heritages, one of the world's heritage which we got from Iran. So, but I want to take us a little bit back to how um, polo was developed in Iran. And it's going to show us the interconnectedness of culture, right? And how different ethnic groups and history were still connected to our ancient past. So that's what I'm going to do today. And I'm going to talk about some of the different ancient civilizations and empires that came up in the region that's known as Iran today. They left their markers and their culture. And so that's sort of what I want to do in this quick discussion. So, polo is said to go back 2,500 years. Some say that it was played in Iran as a form of military uh, preparation in the 6th century BC. 6th century BC. 6th century, that was the time of Cyrus the Great of Persia, right? He was the first great um, Persian ruler. And of course, I've talked about Cyrus the Great, how he's in the Bible, right, as the king who would liberate um, the Hebrew people from their Babylonian captivity, right? That's in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah, and several books in the Bible. But I'm not gonna. That's not what I'm focusing on today. Right now, I want to talk about how polo developed. So prior to Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus is known as the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, right? The Achaemenid Empire came up roughly about 550 BC, right? The 6th century. Prior to that, there was an empire of the Medes, right? The Median Empire. The Medes came from they ruled that area of that's known as Iran today, that region, and of course between 678 BC and 550 BC. So that was the Median Empire. Now, the Median Empire was not just Iran, but it also encompassed parts of Iraq, um, you know, um, and other, and other parts. But I want to focus on how these empires left their markers and civilization on the Iranian people. So, but prior to the Median Empire, so the Medes and the Persian Empire under Cyrus. So these were located in the northwestern and western part of Iran, what is known as Iran today. Um, the Medes were western and northwestern part of what's known as Iran today, while the Persian Empire that took over from them, right, that overthrew them, um, that's more southern, right? And so that was the first true Persian Empire from the Fars region. And the Fars, of course, their language is Farsi, and that's the Persian language, right, that we know today, the Farsi, the Persian language. That's 2,500 years ago. So that's one of the tribes, one of the ethnic groups, one of the cultures in the area of Iran. Now, but they had a habit of merging other groups. So the Medes before them were sort of merged culturally with the Persian Empire. So it's known as the Medo Persian era, right? So the Persians, right? But prior to the Medes, there were a group of people who were known who left their mark, left their trail, and left their genes because they merged with a lot of the people there, and through intermarriage, intermixing. This was very common, right? Back in ancient civilizations, right? The Greeks are said to have left their DNA, their genes around. So did the Romans, right? So there was a group prior to the Medes. The Medes were a sedentary group. So were the Persians. So they started to establish cities. They went nomads. But prior to them were a group of nomads, right? And these nomads were they were known as fierce horse warriors, right? They were expert horse warriors. They were archers and they shot their arrows right while riding horses, right? And so these people were actually known as the Scythians. So the Scythians, they're in ancient literature, they're in the Bible, right? So the Scythians were fierce horse warriors, and they dominated what's called the steppes area, the steppes from Ukraine, Russia, Central Asia. They dominated and they were nomads, right? Nomads are people who move around, right? They don't settle down. They're not city people. They're not typically agriculturists. So these Scythians were moving around and they were moving uh, through through the area of Iran, right? From about this the ninth century, and they disturbed a lot of the Persian kingdoms, right? They would terrorize. Well, they would um, they would sort of disturb, agitate, right? Disrupt. They were thorn uh, to the established sedentary Persian kingdoms, right? Of Darius, for instance, the king Darius I. So they disturbed them a lot. These were the Scythians, and they were horse warriors. They came around from about the ninth century BC. So they were actually dominant. They dominated that area from ninth century to the third century BC. They also they were very good in arts, right? Artwork. So you see, because they left their markers, their genes, they were experts in artwork. They are known for their arts, their artistic nature, right? Uh, Even though they were nomads, right? They were nomads. They lived in wagons, tents, and they were mobile. Again, they rode their cavalry. And so this actually would influence Iranians and Persians. This would influence the Persians a lot. Um, so their descendants, again, they established between ninth century and the third century. So you can see their expertise on the cavalry using riding horses. It was around this time that their horse riding, would have developed amongst uh, the Persian people, right? That they left that marker, that influence on the Persian people. So around the sixth century, the kings developed a game they called it shogun, right? Shogun. It's still called shogun today in Iran, and that's the game of polo. So it was for military preparation. So it's a sport. That's the game of polo we know. Of course, polo is played on horses, right? And it's typically called the game of kings, right? So the aristocrats like to play polo. It's very popular with the nobility, the kings of England, and many rich people are known to play polo. So it was developed amongst the Persians, and it's still called. Uh, so it's called shogun. It's still called shogun today in Persia, but it's known to the world as polo, the sport of polo. So the influence was from the Scythians, right? The Scythians were they were riding through the steppes, right, between the and passing through, traversing Iran, uh, passing through between the ninth century and third century BC. Now, um, the descendants of the Scythians, right? Some some Scythians would now establish. They become the Parni people, and they would establish, conquer an area, right? It was called Parthia at the time, an ancient area. It was called the Parthia, and they would establish the Parthian kingdom. The Parthian kingdom would sort of overthrow the the Achaemenid empire, of which Cyrus the Great had created, so which the Persians had created. So the Parthian Empire, the Parthian Kingdom, they ruled, dominated Iran, the area between the third century BC and the third century AD, right? So they were Scythians. They established and became the Parni. They established a kingdom. The capital is in uh, Khorasan, the Khorasan province today, which is in Iran. It's still within Iran. It's in northeastern Iran, right? The Khorasan region. So that's that was where the capital of the Parthian uh, empire, the Parthian kingdom, was established, right? Um, so they were the ones who Julius Caesar, right, came in contact with a lot, right? And so they were horse riders. Their style of warfare was horse riding, the cavalry. So it wasn't easy for the Romans to conquer them. So the Romans were constantly fighting them, right? The Parthians, right? The Parthian kingdom. And those were, the Iranians. They left their markers amongst them. So the Romans were constantly fighting them. The Romans couldn't conquer them. It was in reference to them, like Caesar's wars with them, that Julius Caesar said the famous, one of the most famous uh, phrases of conquest, actually the most famous phrase of conquest, right, by a general: I came, I saw, I conquered. In Latin, it's Veni, Vidi, Vici, right? Veni, Vidi, Vici. So it's very famous. Of course, Jay-Z also popularized it in his rap when he says, I came, I saw, I conquered, right? So it was in reference to the Parthian kingdom that Julius Caesar made that statement. So they would dominate, conquer briefly, but they would shake them off. So it was very difficult for the Romans, who were a cavalry, they were infantry organized, right? They were foot soldiers, to fight them, the Parthians, because they were cavalry. They rode on horses. That was their style of warfare. And of course, those mountainous regions, right, were very difficult. The Zagros Mountains, where the Medes, the Persians had established, it was very difficult to penetrate, right, for outsiders to penetrate. So that's why Augustus Caesar, right, the first emperor of Rome, established the boundary of his kingdom at the Parthian Empire. So you can say, well, the Iranian border, right? Iranian border. Most of that absorbed uh, modern day Iraq as well, and some parts of Turkey, right? And other places, Pakistan and all those places, they were merged. So, but in terms of culture, that's what I want us to focus on: the culture they were living behind. So you had the Scythians, the Parthians, they don't exist anymore. The Parthians, they don't exist anymore within Iran. The closest to them, the capital is still there, Khorasan, right? Khorasan is it's in northeastern Iran. Um, the Medians, right, who started the sedentary settlements, the Median Empire of the seventh century, right, 678 BC, the Median Kingdom. Their capital was around. They established their capital around Hamadan. Hamadan is about 220 miles from Tehran today, right? So about 200, over 220 miles, roughly 223 miles from uh, Tehran today. So that's Median. So you see how history is, keeps these civilizations are linked and through history. And so the Scythians, who were the famous horse warriors and archers who could shoot their archery, use weapons while riding expertly on horses from the ninth century, right? The Scythians would, where are they today? Majority of the Scythians, although they left their markers, they mingled, they mixed with the Iranians. So modern day Iranians have genetics. You find their genes of the Scythians amongst modern day Iranians. Um, and of course, they were the ones who established the Parthian Empire, right? The Parthian kingdom, which of course ended up, it fell around the third century AD, but again, they were nomads. They Their closest descendants are the people called Ossetians, right? The Ossetians. The Ossetians um, settled in the Caucasian territories, right, of Iran. Now, I did an earlier video in which I talked about the Russo-Persian Wars. The Russo-Persian Wars between 1804 and 1813, and one between 1826 and 1828, in which Persia lost, it ceded its uh, uh, territories in the Caucasus area, right? Ceded them to Russia, lost them to Russia, losing Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. So the Ossetians, right, who were the descendants, direct descendants of the Scythians, right? Those are the closest people to the Scythians who rode on horseback, who were experts archers, who were nomads, and they were just passing through, right? They were nomadic. The most direct descendants, the most direct people of the Scythians would be the Ossetians, right? The Ossetians are now in Georgia, right? They're in modern day Georgia. So Iran lost that region to Russia, right? And Georgia, of course, was part of the USSR. Georgia is a country on its own today. Who is a Georgian? The most famous Georgian that we know, or infamous, right? That's Joseph Stalin, who was the dictator of the USSR, the longest dictator of the USSR, Union of uh, Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, which was one of the superpowers during the Cold War. So Joseph Stalin was a descendant of these Scythians, right? These fierce warrior Scythians who rode on horseback, right? Who rode on horseback, did conquer, um, who did conquer, Persia, the Persian kingdom, and established the Parthian kingdom, right? The Parthian kingdom. They left behind, their capital is in Khorasan today, which is still in Iran, but the Ossetians moved on, right? And they settled, became pastoralists, sort of settled down in Georgia. Georgia was taken by Russia after, the Russo-Persian Wars, and a direct descendant, someone who was an Ossetian, someone from Georgia, is Joseph Stalin. So you see how history is linked. Joseph Stalin was a Georgian descendant, can be said that to be a descendant of the Scythians of the ninth century BC, who were fierce horse warriors. So you see how history is linked, very interrelated. So again, I'm doing this just recognizing how the Persians gave us the game of polo, right? The Persians call it shogun. Yeah, they still call it shogun today. Um, so actually, chogun, not shogun. Some people call it shogun. It can be called chogun, so it's chogun. And so chogun, which is also called polo, the game of polo. Um, you know, so kind of cool, kind of interesting. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.